Hi, my name is Paco Nathan. I'm managing partner at Derwen and here to present the 2021 Industry Survey Analysis Report. So this report was done by Ben Lorca and myself through Gradient Flow, sponsored by John Snow Labs, and it's about how companies are using NLP in industry use cases. What are the trends and insights that we can find from contrast studies with survey results? There's a free download. So if you go to this URL, gradientflow.com, 2021 NLP survey. Now, as far as overview, just some background, we ran this from June to August in 2021. It was a global online survey. People were recruited through social media, online advertising, newsletters, outreach to various partners, etc. And we got a total of 655 respondents from more than 50 countries. The other thing that's really salient here to understand is a quarter of the respondents are in some form of technical leadership role. So the way that we're approaching the analysis of the results is by developing contrast studies. So we'll take a look at what are the results of, say, people in a technical leadership role versus general audience, or break it down into segments of mature or exploring or not started yet as far as maturity of companies and their NLP practice, and then say, what's the contrast between a mature practice and general audience or people not starting yet. So just high level, we'll go into more detail here, but at a top level, the tech leaders tend to emphasize certain key features for NLP solutions. Number one, accuracy. Number two, production readiness. And number three, scalability. These are the hot buttons. We'll break this down into more detail. Accuracy in particular is something that it's got a lot of dimensions to it. Now, in contrast, they cite that the difficulties they run into have to do with tuning models and also costs in general, but specifically costs based on cloud services. As far as use cases, tech leaders singled out NER and document classification as the primary use cases for NLP. And we'll drill down into some more details about those. Overall, a third of all respondents say that they're using Spark NLP. So it's the single most popular NLP library in the survey. That said, 53% are using at least one of the following open source NLP libraries within Python. And I should note, in my practice, we're mostly working in Python, of course, C++ under the hood. When you are doing that, typically in your pipelines, you're using two or more of these libraries together. Also, top line, 60% of tech leaders indicated their budgets grew by at least 10%. We'll break that down a little bit more, but there's definitely been strong growth continuing. Definitely good news as far as growth in NLP budgets. 83% of all respondents use at least one of the top cloud services for NLP, and we'll break that down in further detail. 34% of all tech leaders state that their organization uses Google Cloud NLP services. So it's the most popular cloud service for NLP for the second straight year in a row. And, it goes without saying, 2020 was an incredibly challenging year in many ways. It's interesting to look at the year-over-year trends, contrasting between this year's report and the one from last year. We'll look toward the end at some of the outcomes of the end of 2020 and what were some of the key drivers that actually helped to lead to a lot more growth in NLP applications. So just to preface a bit, demographics, we have the breakdown here. A lot of the respondents came out of Asia Pac, with India being the single largest country among respondents, and then the US being second. So you can see the breakdown between Asia Pac, Americas, and EMEA. And then in terms of industries, the lion's share go to the top three: healthcare, CET, and education. So that's interesting. At least this is what reflects the audience that we had for the respondents. Um, and so, as mentioned, in terms of use cases, document classification and named entity recognition (NER), these are the two most popular. And if you download the report, you can see the breakdown. We've got a lot of histograms that do some contrast studies. We'll go into more detail. Of course, NER, it's an important component of most kinds of language applications. It's generally speaking, it's a first step in a pipeline as you're developing some sort of information extraction, say, for instance, out of documents. Um, and definitely we're getting the signal that about the practical benefits of NER. As we're seeing companies progress further along the NLP adoption curve, um, furthering along their maturity of NLP adoption in industry. Certainly, we're seeing a lot more use of NER because get this higher rate amongst the early stage companies because, of course, NER is one of the first things they have to do in their pipelines. Also, NER is increasingly applied alongside, say, entity linking or developing graph data for use of graph technologies. And certainly in my own practice at Derwen, we do a lot of work with graph technologies, and indeed that is the case. Looking ahead, we would anticipate more growth in a couple of other areas, though. Q&A, question and answer, and natural language generation, or abstractive summarization is probably a better way to say. These are a couple of use cases that are increasingly being powered by large language models, and there's a lot of open source for that, a lot of use cases that have been emerging on the horizon. So, here we've broken down, again, based on the survey results, where are the key NLP use cases based on the verticals. So, for instance, you can see NER is being represented there in terms of CET, healthcare, education, also financial services and pharma. This is interesting. Again, being a practitioner, I can say that our firm does a lot of work with entity linking and knowledge graph technologies. And also, I'm involved, for what it's worth, in other conferences specific to graph technologies. And based on that experience, I would say that the top verticals in that space are, generally speaking, almost always the top three are pharma, financial services, and manufacturing. However, in our results, we really didn't get a lot of response back from manufacturing. Of course, manufacturing has, shall we say, a different view about proprietary nature of what they're doing. It's fiercely competitive, so we may not be getting a lot of response back in that particular area. But I'll just call out that this slide here, I would question it because I think I'm actually, being a practitioner in the space, I'm seeing a little bit different view here. Again, we're living with the results we had and basing the study off the data. Now, in terms of budgets, there's a lot of great news. NLP budgets look better compared with 2020 results. Definitely this period when we were getting the survey results back in from June to August, it was a time when many countries, felt that they had better control of the pandemic, at least compared to year over year in the same period in 2020. And also, we're taking a look at what are the responses, particularly from those who are in technical leadership roles who understand where the budgets are steering. So 60% of tech leaders indicate that NLP budgets grew by at least 10%. And half of the respondents from organizations with mature practices indicate that their NLP budgets grew by at least 10%. So there's a very strong signal there. 33% of tech leaders say that their budgets grew by at least 30%. And then the top 15 indicate their budgets have more than doubled. So we're seeing strong year-over-year growth in this area. This should be good news for consultants in the space. As far as the tools and solutions, we get a lot of information back there. This is all just summarized. Certainly, this area is continuing to grow. Open source has had a very, very big effect on the growth in this area, and probably nowhere else is that as dramatic as Hugging Face, where the model repository now has over 16,000 models that are being shared. We did try to understand, what criteria are technical leaders using when they go to evaluate NLP tools. And again, the top three: accuracy, production readiness, and scalability. Accuracy is a big word. Accuracy, formally speaking, in terms of statistical analysis of machine learning results, accuracy could mean any of five different things. And then when you look at industry usage of the term, it could mean even more. So in this case, what we're seeing is accuracy tends to refer to the effectiveness of pre-trained models that come packaged with libraries. How well do they work out of the box? And this is important because NLP projects, applications of NLP in general, um, you have to consider these are almost always pipelines, and there are multiple models used. Typically, different models are used at each different stage. And so you can get a cascade of effects where if models are not fitting your domain specifically, you can get this cascade effect where you get increasingly more and more distortion or inaccuracies propagated down a pipeline. And so that's an interesting thing because we're seeing services popping up and sort of promising to have a general case of technology, but yet realistically, what we find is that out in industry, you do need to fine tune the models. And so that's probably a lot of the driver for the reporting of accuracy being a big hot button. Tech leaders continue to put a premium on production readiness and scalability. 24% of all tech leaders cite production readiness as the most important criteria, though, for their technology selections. Again, words to the wise. Now, taking a look at the distribution, certainly in last year's study, we saw Spark NLP as being the most popular individual library. Again, we saw that here, people using big data frameworks like Apache Spark, Databricks, obviously is very appealing to pull Spark NLP in there. Certainly, though, these tools, we see a lot of usage, obviously, in the Python PyData tech stack, if you will. So I have to admit, I come from more of the Python and C++ side of the world, even though I used to be the evangelist for Spark. And certainly in my practice, we're seeing most of our NLP use cases for large customers being out there in Python and C++, and certainly Spacey, PyTorch, Hugging Face, Flare, and others coming up, but definitely more that side of the world is what I see represented in my practice. And 53% of the tech leaders in our survey responded that their organization is using at least one of those libraries. I should also mention that when you're developing pipelines out of those kind of libraries, typically you're mixing and matching two or more of them. So try not to take this from the perspective of there's one library that's better than all the others. Typically, it's a mix and match game. I should also mention, too, that one of the factors here in our survey is we did get a lot of response in healthcare. And healthcare in particular, as we pointed out in our 2021 AI in Healthcare survey and report, healthcare is a specialized beast. Healthcare requires additional certification and training. If you're working in data science or data engineer in healthcare, you need to have that additional expertise that's domain specific, and also probably working with a lot of legacy systems. So there's probably a lot of appeal. Spark NLP, of course, has very large representation within healthcare. So that may be some of what's driving these results in this direction. Now, as far as cloud services, as mentioned, 83% of all respondents use at least one of the large cloud vendors' NLP services. AWS Comprehend, Azure Text Analytics, Google Cloud Natural Language AI, or IBM Watson NLU. 79% of tech leaders state that they use at least one of these four cloud services. 78 of respondents who are working at mature practices in NLP use one of these services. 84% of respondents are still exploring how to roll out NLP adoption. They state that they use at least one of these NLP cloud services, and 45% of the people in the exploring category are using Google Cloud. Also, we see about over a third of the tech leaders are using Google Cloud. So for the second year in a row, we're seeing Google Cloud leading amongst the NLP services. Now, having said that, the survey does point out that there are certainly some pain points regarding use of cloud services. One is just the pricing model. When you compare and contrast between Google Cloud, Amazon Comprehend, Azure Text Analytics, their pricing strategies, they you know they vary to quite a great extent. The one thing they have in common is that when you start out and you're using a relatively small amount of documents, it's not that expensive. But as you scale up the number of documents, the expense continues to grow. And so we anticipate that these kinds of pricing models, unless they're updated for high volume discounts, they will probably continue to drive more usage toward open source. It doesn't make sense to scale out your NLP adoption in the cloud if you're not getting some sort of price break at volume. Also, another thing that goes in hand with that is, again, people are reporting that there is no one size fits all. You need to go and fine tune models for your specific domain. So, if the cloud vendors are providing very general purpose kinds of models, something that, say, has been trained on Wikipedia, how is that going to translate to your healthcare application? Okay, it doesn't. And so you end up having to spend more money to fine tune or work around some of the problems that are introduced because of these cloud services. So, again, this is the kind of things, these factors are driving people toward open source. So, in terms of closing thoughts, there's a few summary analysis. We have a lot more in the report, but I just want to touch on some of the high points. One is that in contrast to last year's study, we're seeing now that medium-sized organizations are placing more priority on two factors: scalability and fit with the existing software stack. So year over year, we're seeing this growth amongst the mid-sized segment in terms of their feeling of pain points about production ready, fitting in with the existing stack, and scalability. And what this probably reflects is growth in maturity and budget for midsize. That is to say that firms that were earlier in the curve last year, now as they're maturing, they're contending with more and more issues about integration and scale of NLP in production. So we do imagine to see more of this continued growth in midsize. Again, word to the wise about consultants about where you would anticipate growth in the market. And as mentioned, there are serious implications about the pricing models for cloud services as a practice scales. The more documents you process on a regular basis, the more that it makes sense to use open source. Another thing, of course, that strikes out, I've mentioned this a few times before, but Hugging Face jumped up to the #2 ranking. And certainly we're seeing a lot of signals of adoption across the board of leveraging Hugging Face. And with a caveat that typically with NLP applications that are using open source, especially in Python, you see these multi-stage workflows. You may mix and match from a variety of libraries, such as Hugging Face plus Spacey and Allen NLP. For what it's worth, I work in that area. I'm lead committer on PyText Rank. I'm also associated with another open source project called Rubrics, which is an integration of Hugging Face and Spacey and PyTorch. And this is definitely what we're seeing, is this kind of mix and match effect. There is limited feasibility of retraining general purpose models for specific use cases. And we imagine this will likely continue to pose problems until the tools become easier to use in terms of making tuning simpler and more cost effective. And so that's certainly an opportunity in marketplace, is try to address that pain point. We're also seeing that demand for annotation tools remains strong. 35% of mature companies are using some form of data annotation tool. That is to say, they're tuning the off-the-shelf models for their specific domain purposes and applications. And of course, that growth, that's going to go hand in hand with what we're seeing happen with Hugging Face. Definitely those things are going on together. Now, subsequent to the events of 2020, unfortunate events, pandemic, et cetera, there have been a lot of increased needs for NLP. We've definitely seen this in terms of detecting fraudulent news reports and handling a lot of distortions in social media. There's a lot of need for things like key point analysis and argument support, moving more and more into commercial applications. So these types of NLP applications are becoming more mainstream. The pandemic also highlighted more urgent needs, for instance, for summarizing, the torrent of scientific publications. So, for example, we've seen applications of looking at preprint publication of scientific literature related to COVID-19, where summaries of research can be brought back to human scale by leveraging NLP and abstractive summarization. And that way, for the frontline healthcare workers who are overworked, instead of having to read volumes of papers, they can read summaries. Certainly, there have been some great services surfacing over the past year and a half about that. And it does point to the need in general for just bringing, whether we're talking about scientific papers in life sciences and healthcare, or maybe we're talking about material science and manufacturing, maybe we're talking about patent applications, et cetera, this torrent of documents coming out, it needs to be summarized to bring it back to human scale so that people can work with the information. All right. And so, as far as acknowledgments, again, thank you to John Snow Labs for sponsoring this survey this year, second year in a row. Also, a big shout out to our colleagues Kathy Yu and Jen Webb, who helped so much in the development of this report. This was conducted through Gradient Flow, and on the website, there's a statement of editorial independence. And if you want to get a hold of me regarding publications, conference summaries, etc., here's how to reach me. Twitter is probably the best approach. Thank you very much.